All right. So I have Dan Norton here again. And how's it going?
Hey, good to be here.
Um, and so we're just going to get right into it. And I wanted to talk with you about money and how why society should have money and do what we do with it, what we do. I've watched a handful of debates you've had on taxation. Is taxation theft? And talking about the history of trying out different things and why it's worked here and not here and different things like that. But what I want to do with you is kind of go back further to looking at the idea of a society just starting out and no money is created. Um, and maybe some trade has happened where these guys grew potatoes and they traded the guys that grew corn, and a government's formed for the same whatever reasons we might think a government should be formed to prevent people from killing, to have a prison. What have been thinking about looking at, because I've always wanted to challenge the idea of taxation being theft, I want to look at money and the idea of it being created and try to decide if I think of it even as property, or why we should view it as something that should even exist, and when it exists, um, who gets to decide like what its value is. So anyways, just hearing that brief idea, do you want to share with me what you would think if you were kind of put in charge of a small society of like 10,000 people, or maybe 100,000 people, and you were one of the people that got to throw out ideas of, hey, we should create this thing called money? Like, what would you think of this?
Okay. First of all, I'm going to put on my sunglasses
Okay,
because it is quite bright out here where I am, and I don't want to be squinting the whole time.
for sure.
Okay, so there was a lot that came up just in that brief little intro. So the idea is we're starting out in a barter kind of society. There's no money, there's just trade, and there's about 10,000 people, and
Mhm.
um, there's a question of how should that society operates. There are various questions that should come out. You said, like,
Mhm.
if I'm in charge, what would I do? Before I get to that, though, I just want to briefly make a comment on the taxation is theft point. I actually don't use that line. I know many people who are libertarians use that line, and I think that there might be a sense in which I would agree with it. I think taxation is wrong and unjust because I think it violates rights. I think it involves the use of coercion, the initiation of force, and I oppose it on those grounds. But if theft is doing something illegal and taxation has been legally instituted by government, they passed laws. Technically, I think it might be incorrect to say it's theft,
Mhm.
since it's not technically illegal. But that, I don't think that affects the point. I think the more important
Mhm.
point, which is that it's unjust and a violation of rights.
Yeah.
So just wanted to make that point. Um, but we can get back into the scenario you were describing. So, could you just briefly reiterate the question again? Like, what would I do if I were in charge of such a society?
Yeah. Well, before I do that, I actually think we could bounce off of something you just said, where you're talking about that it's not theft because of how it's set up. But I used to imagine the same idea where, like, if I go to work right now and somebody gives me money, if I have a stack of money in my hand, then if somebody takes that, we'd call that theft. But the only reason I'd call it theft and even care is because it's money that means something to me. Like, it means something within our society. So something I've been challenging myself on recently is, like, so in our society that means something because it's been created for a purpose. But if all of a sudden we started trading in marbles and this stack of paper that's green and has numbers on it means nothing anymore, if somebody stole it, I wouldn't care. I wouldn't go to the police because that means nothing. So I've been kind of dabbling with the idea of, if a society starts off, so me and you, we were born into a society, so that's different. But if a society starts off and a government is formed, and they say, we're going to create this money to mean something, and within creating it, it's going to, when you make it, anybody that ever makes it will put a certain amount in to help our society. So part of its purpose is this. I'm not claiming that other societies that's the case, or even the US or anything, but if that were the case, if the society creating the money created it with that being its intent, somebody could argue to remove that purpose. But if that purpose is already there for that, then it's not even my money they're taking. They created this thing and said, hey, if you go to this place called a work, and if you work, you'll get a certain amount of money. And then your work will also give us, the government, part of it as well. And that's what the money means. So I guess I'm trying to break down if that's wrong, or does that make sense, that idea?
I think I'm getting bits and pieces. I don't know that it's all gelled together yet in my mind, but maybe it
For
will
sure.
as we talk it over. But some thoughts on that. So I think with currency, it should be decided on a voluntary basis. Like I oppose government dictated currency or fiat currency, where it's legislated by the government that people have to use a certain medium of exchange, whether it's gold coins or silver
Mm.
or dollar bills. I think people should be able to come up with their own currency, and over time, over generations, uh, I think people will naturally gravitate to one or a few different types of currency, because I think part of the value of currency is that you don't have just a million different currencies. You want something that is very widely accepted as a medium of exchange. So it kind of defeats the purpose of currency to have a million different things, and you don't know what is valued in what currency, and it would just be chaotic. So you want a small number of currencies, but I think whatever the currency is, it should be developed by private means. It shouldn't just be legislated. The government shouldn't have the power to force people coercively to use a certain currency. So I think
Yeah.
it should just come about as a free market method of exchange.
Okay. And so government shouldn't even be the ones to create the currency.
I think that's correct.
Gotcha. Now, do you have much knowledge on that? I don't. I mean, I know that forms of currency date back to at least like Julius Caesar, but like so money in the US, like when people came over from France, Spain, England, and were created the 13 colonies, did money just they just used the money that was from England? Is this correct?
I don't know much about the history of currency, but I mean, gold and silver have been used for centuries. I don't know when they started being used, maybe thousands of years ago. And you know, the Spanish, they discovered silver like in the was it the Andes Mountains, South America, lots of silver.
Hmm.
And I think gold was discovered in various places. There's the California gold rush, of course, later in U.S. history.
Okay.
I think those types of currents, I've heard it argued or said by some economists of an objectivist persuasion. I'm very heavily influenced by Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. I've
Hmm.
heard some objectivist economists say that they think that gold would naturally evolve as the primary currency. Although, I mean, it could be represented by bills. You could have bills like IOUs that, you know, say you have, so you don't have to lug around a big heap of gold, which would be very inconvenient. You could have
Yeah.
notes that represent the gold, but I think gold would be the thing that backs up those notes. It wouldn't just be a free floating fiat currency where you can just
Hmm.
print as much of it as you want. As I think it is something like that is done today by the Fed. I oppose that practice of fiat
Okay.
money where you just
So
inflate the currency.
so the idea would just essentially be something like trade, where some people could trade vegetables for other vegetables or animals for other animals. But you're saying the most reasonable thing would be something that is more tangible, like gold or silver, but that in the same sense of trading vegetables, if you trade gold, you're trading this thing that has its worth. So I guess here's where I would find it complicated is if everybody's trade is within, if they're just trading things that they have interest in. So if I think I just learned something about some like Native Americans would like trade these like bead necklaces because if you had this certain kind of material on the necklace, then it showed you were like higher up or something like that. Um, if people just trade these various different things, I don't think anybody would ever create any kind of money. And then you wouldn't have like, so do you not see benefit in having currency in the sense of like having credit cards and the ability of having a number that when you go from country to country, we can see like what a US dollar is compared to a Canadian dollar and have more of a connected system? Do you think it should be more so just person to person and no like bank accounts?
Oh no, I am perfectly fine with bank accounts and having different currencies around the world and exchange rates. My main concern is just that it's voluntary. I just don't want the
Mm.
government forcing people to use or to accept a certain currency.
Okay.
So,
Should
but
the government?
whatever naturally evolves voluntarily, I think is fine.
Okay. Like I feel like it almost makes more sense for the government to be what controls making it understood like what the currency means because well, would you say at least that the government should control the holding people accountable? Like you mentioned like an IOU. Would that IOU have to be like signed by a person and a witness and maybe a lawyer, or would we just hope that the IOU will be held up by the person that gives it?
Well, the government can enforce and can and should, I think, enforce contracts. So if you have a contract with someone that I'm going to give you some good or service in exchange for X number of gold coins or silver coins or dollar bills, and then you fail to follow through on that contract, then I think you should be able to take someone to court for violating what they voluntarily agreed to do with you. So the government can enforce those contracts, and I think that's when it would step in, not issuing the
Hmm.
currency, but when someone breaks their agreement to hand over a certain amount of currency in exchange for some good or service.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, and then so I don't know like how much gold exists and how exactly that kind of thing would transfer over. But if you imagine that the government didn't create the money, but the people created the money, and imagine we were going to use like coins like we use and not that we use them often, but like dollar bills and stuff like that. Who would print them if the government wasn't like connected to it?
Maybe banks would themselves print notes or outsource to some third party to print notes. I think I don't know much about the history of this, but I think in the earlier days of the United States, banks did issue their own notes. It wasn't just greenbacks
Mm.
printed by the U.S. Treasury. I think individual banks actually issue notes. Um, and so a couple free market historians I've heard mentioned, George Selgin and Lawrence White or Larry White, I believe, have done a lot of research on how banking worked before the Fed stepped in, early when it was more of a free banking era.
Mhm.
And they say that even the U.S. was not as free as places like Canada and Scotland. I think Canada and Scotland were the best examples of free banking as opposed to government or central banking. So
Mhm.
if anyone is interested in the history of how this would actually work, in terms of things like who prints notes and um, maybe if you look into the work of George Selgin or Larry White, you can find some more details on that. But from what I know, um, individual banks could print notes that could draw on their reserve of gold. Um, and then banks could exchange notes with each other. I
Yeah,
don't
I
know
guess
all the
I
details.
For sure. Yeah, I guess I just being a person that doesn't know much about this or the economy at all, I'm just trying to picture it playing out, and I just feel like, I mean, not I don't know what exactly would make the government held accountable, but I'd be more concerned about like banks being accountable as far as like how much you print, the reason you print a certain amount. If you print a certain amount, like how does that affect the value of it? And I just feel like that's something that would be controlled by the government, the legislation, the politicians that decide how our how everything works essentially. Where if a bank could just print out $1,000 bills, what's the difference between that and that same bank printing out another $1,000 bills? Like they're from my understanding, a bank's purpose would be to make money, but not to because they want it to come in. If they can print it themselves, I guess I just wonder how that would be regulated.
Well, I don't think it should be regulated by the government, but that doesn't mean there are more and less good ways of doing it. So
Okay.
I think that the value of having a something like a gold standard or a silver standard is that you can't just print it arbitrarily.
Mm-hmm.
So what you want is something that's scarce. It's not like air, right? It's just an
Mm-hmm.
infinite amount of it, essentially. You want something that's scarce that you can't just print out of thin air. And in gold and silver are scarce goods, and they have other properties as well, like they're divisible, they're homogeneous. Um, so there are reasons historically that metals have been used as currency bases. But then if you kind of layer on top of that a currency like dollar bills that can represent gold, well, that currency has to be backed by gold. So if you just arbitrarily print out, 1,000 times more money, well, that money's gonna it still has to draw on the same pile of gold that you have in the vault
Mm-hmm.
somewhere. So if you increase, let's say you start out with $1,000, $1,000 bills in circulation, and then you just arbitrarily increase it to $1 million in circulation, well, then I guess the purchasing power of those each individual dollar bill is just going to go down by 1,000-fold because
Yeah.
it still has the same amount of gold to draw on. So I
I
don't I
I
don't think it's
guess
really to your advantage just arbitrarily print out more money because it's pulling from the same resources.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I guess I was just imagining that the government would like that's part of their function would be to make that not an issue, where for some reason I would just imagine banks like what like like who would control them? Like the government is the government, so they control what they control, and then depending on what we think they should control, they'd control other things as well. um but as far as controlling banks and their printing, I guess if yeah, I mean, I guess that might be the answer, is that it's not in their interest to even print more than the gold is there for. But then I think it might come down to like which banks get to print the money if there's multiple banks. But again, yeah, I don't have too much of an understanding on that. So I guess let me bring it back to what the original question was that I was going to lay out more of. So we we have what was it, 10,000 people, and it's a small society, and a government has not formed whatsoever, and people are deciding there needs to be a government. People need to be in control of certain things, maybe military, maybe police, and people want the idea. Let's say that you are one of the people that can share ideas for why there should be a monetary system versus just people trading goats for corn. So what do you say when you're at this like debate meeting with other potential politicians for this society about monetary systems?
Well, I would not want to force anyone to switch from barter to currency. I might think it's in people's interest to do so. and I might give reasons for that. I might say, well, isn't it inconvenient to have to lug around your goats wherever you go to get something else? Wouldn't it be nice to just carry some money in your wallet? And this is even before the electronic age. I mean, it could be even we might not even need notes at a certain
Hmm.
point. Um, so I don't think it's. I just think it's something that naturally should evolve, and there might be intermediary steps. Like I've heard that in concentration camps, I think during World War II, sometimes the inmates, they would use cigarettes as
Mm.
currency and trades things with each other in terms of cigarettes. So, maybe there would be some kind of stepping stone currency um, between just barter of the product you ultimately want to use and something like gold
Hmm.
or dollar bills. Um, so I would want to be very hands off. That's my fundamental principle in political philosophy: no coercion. So you can
Yeah.
persuade people to to do things a certain way, but it's no one's business to force other people to engage in a currency. If you want to, in society today, I think there should be a range of options. Like if I want to barter with you, if I don't
Hmm.
want to give you money, if I want to say, hey, I'll give you my motorcycle if you give me your washing machine or whatever.
Yeah.
We should be able to do that. We shouldn't have to use currency. Although if we want to use currency, we should be able to do that too.
Hmm.
So it's just anything that's voluntary should be allowed, in my view.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think that that trade is perfectly fine. I guess, yeah, I'm trying to work in my mind it going from the bartering system to what we have and like all the options of how that could work. And I guess it's just kind of hard. So if you worked on a farm, then somebody could pay you in food because food's a great resource to have. You need take that home, feed your family. But if you just work at a department store and let's say if money hasn't been created yet, then it's going to be very complicated. Is they're not going to be able to pay their workers in vegetables, and so creating the money seems to have benefit. But if you have a government that controls how money works and what the value is, and we all go off the same thing, then it's really easy. This store can pay you this amount based on a standard of living, all these various different things. But if you don't have the government involved, and then somebody wants to call this bill that has a 5 on it, and it has this value, and this is how much food you can get at the store, but then somebody else not too far away wants to call the one that has 5 on it, meaning 10 times that amount. um like each if there's 5 different banks, I don't know if each bank can make their bill mean something different than another one. So I guess I just see the point. I see the value in having everybody being on the same page, but I think the further you get away from the government controlling this aspect, the further away you are on the page, especially when you get to digital, because then what does that number of value mean if somebody else wants that number to mean something else?
I think it's in people's self-interest not to have uh, a huge number of currencies, as I said. So I think the free
Mhm.
market will naturally gravitate towards having a low number of currencies. But I don't think you need the government for that. And I think there's probably other examples of this sort of thing happening, like with USB cables or something.
Mhm.
As the computer industry is evolving, you might have like 4 different size chargers for cell phones or something, and then you have organizations that get together. I don't know the names of them, but over time, I think they come up with standards and they say, "Hey, doesn't it just make sense for us all to standardize the size of our USB ports so we've got more compatibility and people do decide over time it's in their own self-interest to do that. So you don't need the government uh, to in order to get standardization and lack of chaos. I think people see the value in that, so free market will generate it.
Gotcha. Okay. I like that. No, that's very interesting. And I don't necessarily have anything to counter it because again, I'm just wanting to hear ideas and challenge myself and use these ideas. I like that. That's good. Now I do want to bring it to a different level. I kind of want to maybe challenge some of your ideas on maybe extremes in a small government. So so in my mind, a very brief idea of the importance of a society would be that everybody in the society has to be better off than if they were in nature. So nobody wants to live out in nature, running around trying to survive and not living long. So in a society, I think you have to do pretty well. So I'm mostly libertarian. I'm very in favor of just liberty and free market. But when you have people that get to the level of not being able to survive, I see a concern, and I'm wondering at what level it would sway your way of thinking. So let's take something as simple well, yeah, let's take something that's pretty hot topic like the minimum wage. So in my mind, in a society that's thriving and fine and everybody can get by and figure out how to do things, minimum wage, there shouldn't be a minimum wage. Just everybody should do whatever they do. You pay whatever you pay. If you don't like that pay, you go to a different job. But in a society where being paid too little makes it to where you cannot survive, or to where if there aren't enough jobs, like if you have 10,000 people in a society, you have to have approximately 10,000 jobs exist, or the ability for them to get food or shelter and clothes otherwise. So I guess I just kind of want to branch this off to something like minimum wage and hear your thoughts on, are you to the level of leaving it up to whatever people figure out, that if people start actually dying from not being able to afford food, does the government not step in any way?
If I heard you correctly, I'm having a little trouble hearing because there's a leaf blower right outside my yard here, and
Gotcha.
but I take it you can't hear that because I think
I
something
can't.
happened last
Yeah.
time we talked and there was some noise, a helicopter, and you weren't able
Yeah.
to hear it. But
Yeah, that mic is
um,
really good, I think.
yeah, for some reason it filters out those noises. But anyways, on the minimum wage, I do oppose it, and I don't think the government should ever interfere with voluntary relations between uh, a hirer and a worker. I think it should be left up to the voluntary decisions of those people to decide what they are okay working for or offering. And I think that's the best for everyone. And this again comes down to my principle of the non initiation of force.
Mhm.
And I think it's both moral and practical. So I don't think people are going to be worse off if 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 they're freely allowed to decide on these things. You might be able to get some short-term benefit for some select group of people, but in the long run, I think it's worse for the society. An example I sometimes think of when these sorts of discussions come up is, well, what about a mugger on the street? He can certainly make himself better off in the short run by just mugging people. Does that justify it? Well, no, I don't think so. And I think if you allow mugging, it's going to lead to the deterioration of society. And in the long run, the whole society is going to go down the tubes if you allow that sort of behavior. But if you have a principle, the principle of rights, meaning you're not allowed to initiate force against others, you can only use force in self-defense.
Mhm.
If you have that principle and you stick to it, I think in the long run, everyone in society is going to be better off. Not
Mhm.
everyone is going to have an equal amount of wealth, but I don't see equality of wealth as something that we should aim for. I think we should have equality of rights, meaning everyone uh, has the freedom to act on their own judgment and follow their own judgment as long as they're not coercing others. I think that's best for everyone.
For sure. Yeah, and I agree with you on principle, and I definitely agree to you to various different levels. Like if somebody is extremely wealthy and has a yacht and goes on vacations all the time, that is what it is. And if somebody will never go on a vacation for the rest of their lives, I don't think that matters. Like I think people actually compare some people to other people way too much. And I think maybe a better way to look at it is just comparing current humans to humans throughout history. And so even the worse off humans, say in the US, are probably way better off than most humans throughout history. And nobody is owed something like a vacation or a boat or anything like this. But I do have concern. I think what leads to, say, revolutions, and I don't mean threats of revolution, like people getting mad about various different little things that they're not going to really do anything about, but the idea of people actually getting to the level of starving to death. How many deaths would it take now? So I know the answer is, um instead of the government giving money for welfare, or the government making employers give more money for minimum wage, the answer would be donations. And I think in a lot of cases, maybe even most, I think that actually would work out. And I agree with you. I've listened to Milton Friedman and I completely agree with him. I'm a huge fan of Ayn Rand. But I'm wondering, in a system where we were to try that out, how many deaths would it take, or would it be a percentage of the population that die, to adjust that?
I don't really think of it like that. I mean, I think the number of deaths is going to be less
Mhm.
in the kind of system I advocate, a system of freedom,
Sorry, I think
basically.
I think I worded that wrong. I agree. I think there will be less. I'm saying if there aren't, if it's tried out and it fails, because I think that's most people's concern with trying anything out would be the possible failure. If somebody did communism right, it could work, but if it fails, it's not good. So this, I agree. I'm on your side. I mostly lean towards an extreme libertarian side, but I'm just saying, if it was tried and if there weren't enough donations for various things, and let's just say the idea of starvation, if humans in the society started starving to death because of various different things, where the way things worked with employers paying certain people certain money, that I don't know, 80% of the population was doing perfectly fine. A lot of them were going on vacations and doing very well. I'm not saying we need to bring everybody to equal, but I see a concern with the government not stepping in to make sure that people don't die. And I might even let some people die. I'm just wondering, if they were to die of starvation due to this system being put in place, like, is there an idea of, like, would a certain amount of deaths or outcome make you say, we need to change this up for the moment?
Okay. First, you've mentioned the term libertarian a few times. I just want to distance myself from that term
Okay.
a bit, because a lot of people will call me that because that's the closest term they know for the sort of views I advocate. But um, libertarians are often associated with anarchism, and that's a big reason I want to dissociate myself from that term. And
Mhm.
I objectivist, I think, is a better term for
Okay.
me. Uh, so I would consider myself an objectivist, or at least heavily influenced by objectivism.
Mhm.
But getting back to your point or your question, yeah. So the way it's framed as, like, I'm hesitant to go along with the framing, like, what's the
Mhm.
number of deaths, or uh, such that you would be okay, or is there any level of deaths such that you would be okay with the government stepping in? Um, I'm not even sure I know how to process that, because I think that maybe it implies a certain mechanism of how things operate, which I don't accept.
Mhm.
But maybe I can flesh this out a bit more. So there are emergency cases where I do think it's morally justified for individuals to violate rights and initiate force. So example sometimes used here is you're like a Robinson Crusoe type. You're coming from an island. You finally are able to make it back to civilization. Maybe you swim, and you're on the edge of death. And if you don't get some food really fast, you're going to die of starvation. Let's just say that's the case. I think in that case, you would be justified in stealing a loaf of bread or something, stealing an apple from somebody in order to get back on your feet, and have a more long-term kind of existence where you don't have to just swipe whatever's immediately available in order to survive. And then once you get back on your feet, I would think it's probably best to pay the person back who you stole from, or maybe, if they knew your condition, if you explained it to them, they would be, out of their benevolence, they would say, oh, don't worry about it. I'm happy to help you out. You were in such dire circumstances. I understand. Don't worry about it. I'm not going to take you to court over swiping an apple so you didn't die. But I think these emergency cases are very far-fetched, and they're often used to as kind of a wedge to undercut the principle of capitalism. But I don't think they actually work as a wedge to undercut capitalism, because I don't think we shouldn't construct a society or formulate an ethics and ethical principles, like you shouldn't steal, on the basis of emergency cases where you're on the edge of death. Ayn Rand has an article called The Ethics of Emergencies, where she discusses this kind of thing. When we're constructing society, we have to assume that a long-range existence is possible, and then come up with principles of how that sort of society should operate. And if that's the kind of society we're talking about, I think the non-initiation of force principle is a good one. If life were just a constant emergency, we couldn't survive as a species.
Yeah.
So I think I would just try to reframe the whole issue. Like, if we're talking about how to set up society, we can't be assuming these dire cases and then come up with any rational principles.
Well, let me give a realistic example I have, because I think this is a very fascinating idea. In the 60s and prior, there were many states in the South that had signs at restaurants that said only whites allowed. And in my mind, the general go-to, I think any company should do whatever they want to do. Right now, I don't think there should be a law preventing people from not letting certain people of races or genders or anything into a store. It's just going to make them fail. Like, I'm guessing we probably agree that the market will fix that up really quick. But I think in certain situations where you have an extreme and a big issue in a country, like we had with situations where people weren't allowing Black people into whites only places, that I think the government needs to step in and say, we are making a law that if you have a business, you can't discriminate for these reasons. And then once that's kind of figured out, then you can go back to, okay, if we want to let a couple people discriminate here and there, they do it. I think it just depends on the larger impact. So I guess let's talk about that, and then maybe we can stretch that out to talking about how that's affected by money and lives. Do you think that today there should be laws preventing people from choosing who they hire or who can go in a store?
No, I think people they should have the freedom to be racists. And I think those racists should be boycotted. So I think the way to deal with
definitely
with racists is by boycotting them, by ostracizing them, and then let them suffer the consequences of their irrational decisions. But no, I don't think it's it's proper. I don't think it's proper for the government to forcibly stop people from being racist or irrational in other ways. I mean, there's many things that I think, like eating an unhealthy diet, I think is irrational, but I don't think the government should step in and force people to eat a certain diet, or force people to go to church or to not go to church.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I might think it's irrational to go to church and believe in God and take things on faith, but I think people should have the freedom to do that.
Yeah.
Uh,
Okay. So now, then the follow up question would be: do you think when it gets to an extreme, like how bad it was? And I don't even know how bad it was. I don't know if you're more familiar with this. If in movies they make it seem like it was everywhere, I think it was actually only the South. I think in not that northern states weren't racist, but I think the whole whites only restaurants and stuff like that was the South. But even with 50% of the country making it to where all the public areas that you use, you'd have separate drinking fountains, separate bathrooms. Do you think when something gets to an extreme like this, it's worth the government stepping in?
uh, eh, I well, first of all, I don't know like how many of these areas are public versus private. So that this is another issue that factors in.
Mm.
I think,
Let's say private only.
yeah. So if it's private only, I don't think the government should be stepping in, even if a large number of people are doing it. Probably even if it's a majority. Um, I mean, you don't have to eat at
Hmm.
restaurants at all. You could eat at home. You have no rights to eat at somebody's restaurants. I don't think. I think that
Mm-hmm.
would be a form of initiating force on them. They create this business voluntarily, and I think it should be up to them who they trade with, and if they're going to be irrational and not trade with you because of your race, then I think they should have the right to do that. And then again, boycott them and go to maybe there's only one guy in town uh,
Mm-hmm.
who is willing to serve everyone regardless of race. Well, he's going to get a lot more customers, so maybe his
Mm-hmm.
business is going to be booming, and over time he's going to outcompete the bigots because he's going to be getting all the business instead of having all the, let's say, all the blacks spread among 100 different restaurants in a city. If they're all
Mm-hmm.
going to one guy because he's the only one willing to serve them, well, he's going to get,
Yeah.
he can raise his prices through the roof, right? Because
Right.
he's the only
Yeah.
one they can go to, so he can make a ton of money and ton of profits. And other people who are rational businessmen are going to look on that and say, hey, I can get in on some of those profits if
Mm-hmm.
I am also willing to not be a racist. And then I don't
Mm-hmm.
think it's going to be hard if you allow the free market to operate, to root out those kind of irrational practices.
I mean, I agree with you in general, but it didn't seem to work with black people in the South. But yes, I think it mostly works, and I think our biggest problems are when we remove that element. But, but yeah, I guess that's how bad it was in the South in the 60s, 50s, 40s. That if somebody would have had the only restaurant that said blacks and whites can both go there, then there would have been so much hate against that person that the market wouldn't have worked. But that's just because the majority at that time in that location wasn't on that side.
Yeah, I don't know all the details of like the percentages of uh like restaurants, for instance, that were open to people of any race. It'd be interesting to learn more about that. Um,
Yeah.
but I mean, things like education, I don't know. I think there was public education back then, like in the 50s, and so that's a case where you have government interference in a marketplace, um, which I would oppose. So
Mm-hmm.
if the government is coercively segregating the schools, then that's going to perpetuate it longer. Like if you had a free market in schools and you allowed people to patronize any school they wanted instead of having their, um, well, I guess maybe there were some private schools, but maybe they were crowded out, um, because people are spending so much on taxes already, property taxes maybe, to support these schools, so they don't have additional money to send their kid to a private school, so they end up having to use the public schools. But if you had a free market, maybe that segregated system would have evaporated quicker, and they could have
Mm.
more quickly gotten to a non-segregated system. So I would be interested to see, like, to what extent was the government interfering in these markets and slowing down the process of
Yeah.
integration.
Well, and that's the thing. It could have gone better. It could have gone worse. And then I think that's the good thing about hypotheticals, whether they seem realistic or not. Because yeah, if you would have left schools up to the markets, there's a possibility that you're right that it could have gone better. But there's also a good possibility that if there was no legislation change for schools, that instead of ending in the 60s, it would have been like in the 80s for the South, and maybe it would have been way sooner in the North. Which is why I want to come back to this example, even if it's unlikely. If
Well, just one point on that. I
yeah,
do think the free market rewards rationality. So, in general, at least, I would think that um, the freer your market is, the quicker you're going to separate the wheat from the chaff. The quicker you're going to get to a good solution. So I doubt it would have been worse. I think when there's a problem, the freedom makes it go away the fastest. At
mm,
least often, if not always.
yeah, I think in
So
general, like so if they have separate schools for blacks and whites in the South, and it's government ran, and the government's kind of mostly going along with what the people want, but at some point something makes them say we're going to start allowing black kids into this all white school, then that's the government doing its thing. But if the government didn't make that choice and people could just put their kids wherever they wanted to, there's a good chance that there could have been more issues, because even if you're right that the market leans towards rational thinking, if the thinkers in that area aren't rational, I don't know if that's always right.
well, I mean, I think if the thinkers aren't rational, I think they're going to be losing business. So if you're an irrational principal of a school and you have irrational policies, then
Mm.
I think you're going to be outcompeted by principals who are rational, and you're going to
I
attract
got
more
you.
students.
I see what you're saying. Like if
And
somebody started, like if I was there at that time in the South and I started up my own school and I said anybody can come here, then the ones that were being racist against the blacks, they would lose out on the black students going to their school where they would come to mine. You're right. I think that is how that would play out. Okay, well, really quick then, especially because I think we are running out of time. Um, so just imagine that the government steps out of anything money related, and there's no welfare, none of this stuff. People donate money. If you're wealthier, you donate money to different things for helping the homeless, helping these different causes. But let's say it plays out where, for whatever reason, let's say it's going really good for a while with donations, but at some set time, even though 80% of the population are doing well, the donations stop coming in. Even if this is an unrealistic idea, are there a certain amount of deaths that are going to be the autopsies are going to show that all these deaths are caused by starvation? Will there be a certain amount that would lead the government to step in? And even if they don't step in and demand a minimum wage, and even if they don't step in and do welfare with money, do you think the government should step in and have maybe a free food program of sorts where people can come in and eat if they are on the brink of starvation?
I'm I'm again not sure how to process this hypothetical because I think the it's what is very unrealistic, I think, which I think you acknowledge, but um
Well, I
let
don't
me
really think
just
it's unrealistic, but I think that you might,
okay.
so I want to throw that out there.
Okay. Well, let me say some of the ways in which I think it's unrealistic, and then maybe we can build on that or come
Mhm.
back to a different point. But I think realistically, the number of people who cannot support themselves is a tiny, tiny minority. I mean, I think it's well under 1%. So I think this is a very trivial sort of problem. I think it's a non-problem really because it is
Mhm.
so trivial. It would be so easy to take care of in a free market. I've used the example in some of my debates of how easy it is to make money today, especially just by doing something like data entry on a computer, even if you're like paralyzed and you can't leave your home, all you have to do is sit at your computer and type. That's so minimal a way to it's such an easy way that you can make money and support yourself. You might not become rich doing that, but you can support yourself. So in a free society, the ways of you could support yourself are just endless almost. um so I think, I mean, what are we talking about? Are we talking about someone who's paralyzed and has Down syndrome or something? And what kind of person in today's society is such that there's absolutely nothing they could do to support themselves? They can't trade in any way, and they entirely are at the mercy of someone else. I mean,
Yeah.
it's hard even to
Well, I guess
imagine.
we could imagine like automation taking over in a bigger way than it already has, more stores closing down because more things being sold just on Amazon. Now there will be jobs created with these things, but there's also going to be jobs lost. Video stores going from existing to being a red box to being streaming on Netflix. These somebody will have to go and fix the red box machine, but the amount of people that used to work at video stores, I actually was one of them. Those jobs are gone. So just imagining that there's less jobs and there's becoming lesser and lesser and lesser jobs. Now you're right. Right now, a lot of the things you're saying, anybody can go out and do. I could go out and get any, like, not any job, but I can. There's a lot of random jobs that I could get. I'm just saying, in a situation where the jobs start disappearing and you have humans that would, because I mean there have been obviously many times throughout history, even somewhat recent history, where people will like crowd outside of a factory waiting to see if they need any workers, and they say, okay, we can use 10 today, and 10 people go in and then everybody else is sent home. That type of thing could happen again. And I'm just wondering to what level, if the government is flourishing and the majority of the people are flourishing, if there become so fewer jobs that on this system without any assistance from the government might have to step in. I don't want to push it to the level of like needing a UBI, but I wouldn't be surprised if before too long, because of automation, that there has to be some form of a UBI to keep anybody afloat. Now, we don't need to debate if there should be a UBI, but just considering that that's even a possibility, I think it's clear that there's a possibility that at some point there won't be enough jobs for the humans that, say, let's just say, live in the US.
Okay. um this is interesting because it seems like we're so far advanced that we there's like no more work to do. We could just
Mm-hmm.
hang out and what, play video games and consume art and go to the beach. Yet we're worried about people starving to death at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure about like how these fit together, but
Well,
I
you don't.
don't
Well,
think
can
there's
you answer? Well, hold on, real quick though. I'm curious. Then, you don't think there's a possibility with automation, how like when people go to check out at the grocery store, they can do it all themselves. That at some point, um, like data entry, any of these things, you don't think that there's some point in any kind of a possible near future where if you have a certain amount of millions of humans, but then you have half that amount of jobs, you don't think there'll ever be a point where there's less jobs than there are humans?
no, I don't think so. I think there's an endless amount of work to do because you can always make life better. I mean, if we start out as cavemen, just think of, we haven't even gotten to the moon yet. I mean, we visited there, but we haven't set up colonies there. We haven't gotten to Mars. There's a whole
Mm-hmm.
galaxy we could do. There's in just on this Earth. There's innumerable ways life could be. We don't have flying cars yet. What's up with that?
Mm-hmm.
um, and whenever you create a new technology to replace an older technology, you put out, the people who had jobs on the older technology, but by the same token, you create new jobs servicing the new technology and people who are inventing the next technology. So I think there's an endless amount of work that could be done. Um, so, and I mean, we might have a choice in the future of whether to work at all. And some
Mhm.
people who are rich now, like if you're a wealthy heir, you're born into a fortune and you just inherit $1 billion, you
Mhm.
have the choice of whether to work at all. Um, and maybe far more people will have that choice in the future. But I think it'll always be a choice. There's always something you can do to make life better, and that I think someone would be willing to pay you for. So I don't think there's
Mm.
any danger of running out of work.
Okay.
It
Yeah, I
might
don't
be more of
know.
an option whether to work though in the future.
Well, how does that? What do you mean by that? So aside from the billionaires, like
Yeah.
who would not have to work?
I mean, just maybe it just would be people who inherit a lot of money or make a lot of money really fast. Like maybe people can retire sooner. Maybe we'll
Mm.
just be so wealthy as a society in the future that it'll be normal to retire at the age of 35 instead of
Mm.
65.
Gotcha. Or if there's so many jobs replaced by automation, then maybe because less jobs are needed, but the jobs are still there, people will work less. So like instead of working 40 hours, people go to working 20 hours. And then that way, that way instead of one person working 40, you'd have people working 20. That way people are covered. I think there
And
are
your money might go
approaches.
further. Your money might go further. So for the same amount of work, I mean, the amount of value you can get from working 20 hours as a caveman, maybe it takes you 20 hours just to hunt, a few rabbits, and you get
Mhm.
dinner for a couple days. But if you work for 20 hours in the United States today, maybe that's let's say half a week's pay. Maybe you earn $1,000. You get enough money to last you a whole month, perhaps.
Yeah.
So your money goes
Okay.
further for the same amount of work because we've just become so efficient and productive, given all our technology and advancements over thousands of years.
Gotcha. Gotcha. All right. Well, a lot to think about. I think that's probably about it for today. But yeah, thanks for talking.
Yeah, happy to do it. Thanks for having me.
Yep. Take care.
All right. Bye bye.